finished your rough draft! You, my friend, are amazing. Today we're gonna learn how to write second drafts. If you're anything like me, your rough draft isn't a book. Your rough draft is filled with exploration and superfluous detail and really random scenes that don't actually help you advance your story. Some of the characters may be almost where you want them to be, but not quite. Some of the relationships won't really sizzle. You probably know what the overarching conflict is, but it may not have come to life on the page yet in the way that it needs to in your final version. Rough drafts are messy. It's just a fact of life. So your job when turning your rough draft into a second draft is figuring out what story you want to tell and then transforming your rough draft manuscript into a vehicle that adequately tells that story. You want to turn your manuscript into something that resembles a book. Today, I'm going to share with you my 7 steps for writing a solid second draft. Step number 1 will probably not surprise you. Take a break! Take a break between writing your rough draft and second draft. This will help you see your manuscript with clearer eyes and help you isolate exactly what you need to change. While writing, it's very easy to get totally captured by what it is that you're writing and not be able to see it objectively. Now that you're editing the book, you need to be able to see your book as a reader would see your book. The only way to get that distance is to take some time after finishing writing your rough draft. You can still be productive. You can read other books in your genre. You can write book 2. You can start mapping out ideas for book 2. Just because you're taking a break doesn't mean that you're not doing anything. This break is extremely productive because it will let you marinate on what you just wrote and think about it. And if you think about it long enough, you're going to come up with ideas and be really invigorated and ready to go when you start writing your second draft. I recommend taking about a month of a break, but depending on your schedule, you can fudge this a little bit. My rule of thumb is the longer the break, the better, within reason. This brings me to step number 2. Read it objectively. Either print out your manuscript or listen to it all the way through. I like listening to my books using the MacBook speech-to-text feature. I put on my headphones and close my eyes and really try to appreciate the book as if it were a book, even though that's hard to do because you're so familiar with the characters in the world that you just created. But try as hard as you can just to appreciate it for what it is, a rough version of a book. As you read or listen, make notes of everything that you like and don't like in the book. Also, continuously be asking yourself, what can you do to raise the stakes? Often in rough drafts, we tend to shy away from making our stories as intense and climactic as they possibly could be. We tend not to be as mean to our characters as we should be because we're still getting to know them and exploring how they would react to certain situations. Always be asking yourself as you're reading, how can I make this worse? How can I make the villain scarier? How can I make the protagonist need to reach their goal more? How can I keep readers turning the pages and keep them on the edge of their seats? Brainstorm and be creative about how you can raise these stakes. Make note of all the changes that you think you can do in order to raise these stakes. Keep one running list of big changes you want to make to the book. Big changes include things like not killing off a particular character or killing off a particular character. Big changes are things that require larger scale edits in order to make sense in the book. Also, keep a list of small changes. Small changes include things like changing character names, town names, or adding and detracting small scenes that don't impact the overall arc of the book. The biggest changes to your book are going to happen between the first and second drafts. Make a note of every scene that takes you out of this feeling like a book. Did some scenes that you wrote when you were exploring not matter? You're going to have to cut them. It's important that these lists are as detailed as they can be because these impressions are going to be your roadmap heading into this round of edits. So what do you do after you finish reading? It is time to get to know your characters and do your research. Before you start writing your second draft, you need to figure out exactly who every single character that you're writing about is and what it is that they want. You need to isolate how your characters are going to change and what is going to make them change in your story. You need to figure out what it is that they love, what it is that they're afraid of, what it is that makes them get out of bed every morning and fight towards this goal that you've established in your book. Figure out how they're flawed. Turn them into living, breathing people that you can feel when you're writing, and make sure everything is consistent. Before I wrote the second draft of my most recent book, I made a character Wikipedia where I went through every single character in the story and mapped out all of these things in one document. I had everything that I needed to know about those characters all in the same place, from their hair color to their eye color to their relationships with everybody else in the book and more. Not only did this help me figure out these things as I was writing this Wikipedia, but if I was writing and I forgot what Miles's eye color was, I could just whip back to my Wikipedia and figure it out. That way I avoided what I did in my rough draft, which was calling his eye color blue at the beginning and green at the end. I not only included my characters in this Wikipedia, but I also included every place that they went to. My book is based in a fictionalized version of a real-life town, so I was able to find maps of the real-life town and place all of my locations with little Pins. I used Google Maps to take screenshots of this real-life town, and I dropped pins in all of the locations that my characters went all the time. This made describing movement in the book really easy. If my character was walking home from school, I could look at the map and see what else she would be walking by in order to get from the school to her house. That way I could avoid all inconsistencies in describing transportation. Having pictures to go off of is super helpful when writing descriptions of places, and having them all in the same place is easy because you can always refer back to the same document. Also, if you have a complicated world, this is the time to work out all of the inconsistencies that you've discovered in your world building. For example, in my book, I needed to build a paranormal world in which ghosts and some sort of afterlife existed. I needed to figure out all the rules of the ghosts. Could they walk through walls? Could they not walk through walls? Could they touch people? Did everyone who died become a ghost? I figured out all of my world building answers and I put them all in the same document. Here is an example of a character profile I created in my Wikipedia. As you can see, this profile shows where my character was born, how old she is, what nickname she goes by, who her family is, where she works, what her physical parameters are. Also, it talks about different mannerisms or things that she says. I wrote long descriptions of her personality and also her relationships to all the other characters, and by doing this, I got to know her so much better and started to hear her voice in my head as I was writing. I then proceeded to do that with all of my main characters. Take this time to think about your story in your head and think about the people that you're writing about. Make sure you have a really good idea of how your world and the people in it work before approaching your next draft. It's going to save you so much time in the future and make it so you don't have to do as many revision drafts. Surely it must be time to write now, right? Wrong. It is time for step 4. Identify your subplots. It is important when writing a second draft to isolate your main plot from all the other subplots in your book. Let's say you're like me and your main plot was a generic mystery. Some of the subplots that I identified going into my second draft were my romantic subplot, a subplot between my protagonist and her abusive father, and a subplot about one of my characters discovering supernatural powers she didn't know she had. Once you identify all of these individual subplots, you're going to be able to more clearly see how each subplot tracks from the beginning to the end of the book. Each subplot needs to have its own beginning, middle, and end. Seeing them as individual plots is going to make it a lot easier for you to identify whether or not they do have this. Character arcs also count as subplots. I make sure I have character arcs for each of my main characters in the story and make sure that they change between the beginning and the end of the story. Count these as their own subplots and flesh them out and make sure that they have their own individual arcs that are separate from your main plot arc. Once you have this, it's time for step 5. Redo your outline. This is my favorite part. I have a way that I like to outline for second drafts, and I learned it from J.K. Rowling. I read an article once showing how J.K. Rowling outlined one of the Harry Potter books. She created what the article referred to as a series grid, where every single row corresponded to a chapter and every single column corresponded to a subplot. As you can see in this picture, it shows you the chapter number, the time, the title of the chapter, a brief synopsis of the plot, and then each other column refers to a particular subplot in that book. I also saw in an article that Joseph Heller did this for Catch-22. This whole grid idea worked really well for my brain, and this is how I like to outline my second drafts. So here's an example of one of the ones that I've made. So as you can see, I have the number, the time, the title, the plot, and a column for every subplot that I identified prior to writing that second draft. This one isn't fully filled in yet, but as you can see, I was able to track every subplot from the beginning to the end of the book in a way that was fairly easy to follow and that I could see very clearly in correspondence to the other subplots. This is my favorite way to edit any draft of a novel ever. It helps with organization, it allows you to see everything in one giant place, you don't get lost in the nitty-gritty of your outlines, and everything is just there, and it's beautiful. I love my outline. This is the most important part in writing your second draft. In my opinion, this is where the most brain work actually goes. You should put more effort into writing your outline than you actually do the second draft of the book. Pour yourself into writing your outline. Fix every single detail. Make sure that everything is meticulously charted. Turn it into a functioning story here. Use your brain. Divide each section of the story into cliffhangers. Figure out how to break your story up so that it flies forward. I'm not saying you need to use this method of outlining, but this is just the method that works for me. Regardless, when you go and write your second draft, you need to have some sort of outline and you need to have thought about how your book functions before you go and start editing. Editing is an impossible task when you don't have a plan, so make sure that you have a plan before you go into editing. So once you have an outline, it's time for step 6. Move the book into Scrivener. I suppose you don't need to use Scrivener, but Scrivener is an incredible writing tool and so helpful when you're trying to write a draft like this. For those of you who don't know, Scrivener is an incredible word processor. It has a gazillion features that make writing so much easier and make it easier to break up your book into chapters and see everything as a big picture. I still like to write my rough drafts in Word, but after I write my rough drafts, Scrivener is a godsend because it allows me to see everything and keep everything organized. I don't use all of the Scrivener features, I use pretty basic ones, but after I've written my outline, I make make a folder that corresponds to every single chapter I've created in my outline, and I move all of the text corresponding to that chapter into Scrivener. As you can see here, my chapter 1 row in my Excel sheet corresponds to my chapter 1 folder in my Scrivener file. If you are deleting chapters and sections of text, put them into Scrivener anyway, just make sure that you put them in a bucket that already has been created in your outline. Then what I like to do is I like to take all of the text in the row of my Excel spreadsheet corresponding to that chapter in Scrivener and paste it into the synopsis section of that folder. This way, when I go back and edit it, I can already see all of the things that I've identified need to happen in that chapter so that I can edit my chapter and see all of the notes right there in Scrivener. This keeps everything in a very organized place, and I can access all the information very easily, either right on Scrivener or I can go back to Excel if I need to. So once you've divided and compiled all of your information into Scrivener, it's time to write your second draft. This is the part where I turn my brain off and write the book exactly according to my outline. I used my brain to write a really detailed outline, and now I just need to carry it out. I need to trust the person who outlined the book and know that even if I don't feel like putting that in that particular chapter, I need to put that in that particular chapter, otherwise something in the future isn't going to make sense. I treat each individual chapter as a separate unit and make sure that I incorporate all of the changes that I've identified in Excel in that particular chapter. You don't want to set daily word counts to do this because everything gets a little bit muddy when you're editing. Some chapters will fly by that are long if they were really good chapters in your rough draft. Other chapters may need to be scrapped and rewritten entirely, or they will have so many edits that it just feels like it's taking forever to get it to a place where it's actually decent. I try to set a target of doing 1 chapter a day. This is not a perfect system. Sometimes I miss days. Just make sure that you're doing it every day and following through and making sure that you don't stop editing it, because you're so close and now you've made such a great outline that you just need to turn the book into the version of the book that you've outlined. As you're editing, you might discover things about the book that you might want to revise in the future. Resist the urge to edit them now. Try not to go back and change your outline too much, because otherwise it's going to get harder to finish your second draft. Trust that your outline is good enough for you to stick to the outline and get to the end and have it look like a somewhat version of a book. But take note of all of these other edits that you think of as you're going along. This will probably not be the last version of the book that you write, so having this list of edits is going to be helpful for when you do your third draft or a fourth draft and you want to incorporate these changes. Remember, right now your goal is just to turn this manuscript into something resembling a book. It's not going to be perfect, but it is going to have a beginning, middle, and end, and it's going to have subplots. Trust yourself and put in the time, and you are going to get a product that is pretty okay. It's still going to need some work, but you're going to be able to put in the work later. Not everything has to happen right now. Also, this is something important that I didn't mention. Make sure that you're not editing right now so that your prose sounds nice. There's still going to be scenes in the book that you're going to have to cut, so you don't want to spend a lot of time making your prose sound really pretty when chances are you're probably going to have to cut it eventually anyway. Kill your darlings. So that's my process on writing second drafts. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and stay tuned for next week when I make another video talking about how I write third drafts, fourth drafts, and any other revision draft after that that is not a first or second draft. My finger puppet of Charles Dickens says, happy writing.